Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Jeff Barnett. Tonight we're going to have a fascinating conversation with possibly the smartest guy on the planet when it comes to the future of America's relations with the People's Republic of China. And that guy is, of course, Dr. Michael Pillsbury. His new book, The 100-Year Marathon, climbed to #1 and stayed there with the Washington Post book review. You can go on to Amazon and you'll see that it's in the top 10 on several categories. It is a highly readable book, around 230 odd pages of text that goes very quickly, and another 70 pages of footnotes, so you can really drill down into the specifics. It is a marvelous book. Mike, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jeff.
The reviews that you've had on this book so far have been extraordinarily positive. And then people, in fact, at home, if you want, you can go online and you can look at the reviews that he's had in both the Wall Street Journal and Christian Science Monitor. You can also go on YouTube and see his interviews with James Rosen of Fox on the NPR NewsHour with Margaret Warner, Wall Street Journal's TV program, and on C-SPAN on their Book TV. Dr. Pillsbury has been on there now 6 times talking about this book. So, lots of books about China these days, lots of talk about it. People have visited China, people have read about China. Dr. Pillsbury, what's new in this book that we need to know?
Well, my point of view is quite different. There's most books about China, and there's some really excellent ones, are by journalists or professors or Chinese themselves. My book is a little different. It's really an insider's story of the secret things that have been going on, both between the United States, ourselves talking about China and how presidents have made decisions, and then secret things from the Chinese side. So I try to show what the two governments have been doing about each other and to each other. I have a little bit of tourism and a little bit of sort of professorial kind of academic prose, but really I'm trying to tell the story of what the two governments at the very top have been trying to do to each other the last 40 years.
You say the last 40 years, let's kind of go back 40 years ago. The famous Nixon-Kissinger rapprochement with Beijing.
Yes.
The kind of the standard story from our perspective is that was initiated by Nixon and Kissinger.
Yes.
Do you agree?
No.
What happened?
Well, the story was told initially by the American side only. The Chinese said nothing. The Chinese kept secret really until just the last few years, their side of the story. So you really had domination by President Nixon's memoirs, Henry Kissinger's 4 books, and our media that took up its own airplane to fly to Beijing in 1972 to cover the story. And the way the media was briefed at the time, China was kind of poor, stupid, backward, had been engaged in a civil war on itself. And the brilliant diplomacy of President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger knocked on the door of this backward, stupid country and lured them out of their shell with various kind of incentives and really saved China and began a process where the Chinese would, in theory, be grateful to us for opening them up and bringing them the benefits of Western civilization. This was the old story. And Kissinger, in his 4 books, talks about how hard it was to do this. They couldn't find a channel, we didn't have diplomatic relations, intermediaries were untrustworthy, the Chinese side was nervous and suspicious about the Americans, and so this brilliant diplomacy and geopolitical thinking had to be conducted by the American side. And China is really portrayed in that narrative as a passive object on which the brilliant American president and his advisor wrote these marvelous new ideas.
And you don't think that's the real story at all?
No, it's not the real story from two different kinds of evidence. One is the Chinese themselves have begun to release their internal memos. And their story is the opposite, that they tried hard to open up the Americans. They felt themselves under mortal threat from the Soviet Union. They knew that their economic model hadn't worked. They knew that their growth rate was a minus number. They had all kinds of problems that they realized the Americans were the solution.
And this is all back in 1971, 70, 72.
Even earlier, the Chinese have released some memos of 4 generals who wrote to Chairman Mao, we need to open up to the Americans, and here's how we can do it. And then there were some internal Nixon secret documents that I looked up out in the Nixon Library in California to see if this could be true. Could the Chinese story be true, that they tried 5 times to open up America and the American side did not respond? Some of it's pretty dramatic. Chairman Mao Zedong himself tells an American in October 1970, I want Nixon to come to Beijing, whether as a tourist or as a president, I don't care. I need him to come here. And somehow this message is not received. There are 2 more efforts the Chinese have to reach out to us. And the story was told in the declassified archives in the Nixon Library, but then also Kissinger's new book came out about 3 years ago. And to my delight, he reveals some of this material himself. He had access to the memos from the generals. And he says, you know, the Chinese thought up the idea in a parallel way at the same time as Nixon and I did. Well, now that's a complete reversal of the original version, that they were closed and we opened them up. Now he's using the word parallel. And then he quotes the 5 times when the Chinese reached out. And he explains how he and Nixon thought it was really premature, or in one case, the letter hadn't really been signed. It was delivered by the Pakistanis, but it was unsigned, inviting Nixon to come to Beijing, so they didn't do it. Then he describes the 2 times American embassies were approached in Oslo, Norway, and in Kabul, Afghanistan by Chinese wanting to reach out, and how he and Nixon decided to turn that down because, well, these embassies were really too far away to respond. So I was helped a great deal by Kissinger's new book, in which I wouldn't say he changes his story exactly. He adds a lot more to the Chinese side. I go further in my book and I say it's really quite obvious that the Chinese initiated the idea, tried very hard to open us up, and had goals of their own during this period from 1969 to 72. And the American side did not want to do it. And in the documents at the Nixon archives, what I found is the reason why the Americans did not want to open up to China. And that story starts in 1969.
Well, I'm very interested in that story, but what I'm really even more interested in is its relevance to today. Because from an American point of view, we look at China and we see drastic change, a revolutionary change in the 40 years since the time frame that we're talking about. But what you're asserting is that actually there is a continuity, there is a thread between then and now that is going off into the future. That's that thread that I'm really interested in. You know, what is the strategic goal, the strategic plan? What is that vision that they have?
Well, what the story back in 69 to 72 shows is how quickly the Chinese are willing to learn from their mistakes and totally reorient their strategy. They had done quite well in the 50s. The growth rate was between 5 and 7%. There's some CIA declassified materials that show their policies then were relatively good for economic growth. Then they had a bad 10 years of negative growth, but they learned lessons from that.
Expensive lessons.
Very much so. They learned from their 20 to 30 million people killed in the famine and policy errors in 1958 to 60 when they tried to communize the whole country because they got impatient. But the goal of China returning to its once central importance, that remained the same. And a topic of my book is really the rise of the hawks in China. And one of my favorite hawks wrote a book that came out in 2010 called The China Dream. That book gave me the idea for the title of this book. He uses the term the 100-year marathon. And by that he means starting in 1949, in a marathon with the Americans, how can we greatly surpass them by 2049? And he reveals a quote that used to be a secret that Mao told other leaders back in 1955, that China's destiny is to catch up and then surpass America. And Mao then, again this is 1955, Mao then thought it would take from 50 to 75 years. He was wrong. It's going to take a bit longer, but the goal to surpass the Americans has been there for a long, long time. What I'm trying to show in the book is how they have tried to implement this goal by at first seeing us as the enemy, which they realized was a mistake, seeing the Soviet Union as the source of technology and trade, which they realized was a mistake, then trying to turn only on their own resources, they realized was a mistake, and finally getting onto the idea that the Americans are the answer to our dream.
But the Americans are also the great Satan, to some people at least, in your book.
Well,
they
made another mistake. Again, this learning model of China. They got quite pro-American after the Nixon visit in '72. Gradually, you can see a trend of almost 15 years where they become increasingly pro-American. Their youth kind of fall in love with American culture. The Communist Party leader eventually would be put in jail for the rest of his life, under house arrest the rest of his life, for a mistake he makes. He says, we need to reform the Chinese Communist Party, make it more like America, American democracy. He creates a body called the Political Reform Commission. He starts down the path that ultimately results in the Tiananmen incident, and to
with the Statue of Liberty,
the goddess of liberty, and to fix that mistake. Again, you see this brilliant, drastic shift. They change over to hating America and teaching their youth America is the worst model you can have, and America is out to get us. And you must never fall in love with them again.
We're going to take a break here for the station IDs, and we're going to come back. And we're talking with Dr. Michael Pillsbury, whose new book, The 100-Year Marathon, is out. It's available. It is a fast read, and it is fascinating. And so when we come back, we're going to talk about next steps.
Too many women get hit by their boyfriends and husbands. Too many women are pressured into having unprotected sex. Half of the people in the world living with AIDS are women. It doesn't have to be this way. Together, we can change this reality. Let's strive for a world free of violence.
At Volunteers of America, we don't just give kids a way to stay off the streets. We give them the tools they need to reach their full potential. We don't just help the elderly receive needed care. We help them live life to the fullest. We don't just provide food for homeless individuals and families. We provide job training and placement so they can buy groceries. Volunteers of America is a national organization that for over 100 years has provided programs and services that allow people to overcome their challenges to become vital members of their community. At Volunteers of America, we don't just help people, we help people help themselves. Find out how you can support the programs that are working in your community. Contact Volunteers of America today. Call 1-800-899-0089.
Drivers face all kinds of distractions. Before your wireless phone becomes one of them, stop. Drive safely. Keep your phone in easy reach and dial sensibly. In bad weather or traffic, call later and use a hands-free device. Remember, with wireless, safety is your call.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett, and welcome to the Inside Scoop. And we're getting the Inside Scoop on the future of China and U.S. relations with Dr. Michael Pillsbury. Dr. Pillsbury is an undergraduate from Stanford, has his PhD from Columbia, speaks Mandarin fluently, writes the language, has lived in China and in Taiwan, and has served in both Democratic and Republican administrations, both also on the Hill and in the Pentagon. So is a just acknowledged expert on the subject, and his book has gotten rave reviews, the 100-Year Marathon. Part of this contest is between the two nations that's evolving is economic. And the two nations have different economic models. Ours is democratic capitalism, where capitalism is tempered by the democratic system. The Chinese seem to be going what you call in your book, or refer to in your book, as authoritarian capitalism, where it's a capitalistic structure, but it is run by the Communist Party, and that half of the economy is in the hands of the government. Do I understand that right? Is that?
Yes, in many ways, with the help of the World Bank, they've invented a new kind of economics. And one of their best thinkers became the World Bank's chief economist. He's written 5 books on the theory that China used to construct this kind of hybrid economic system that's roughly half free market, half government controlled. And the funny thing is, they claim they got this from us. Not only the World Bank in the last 30 years helped them with the so-called state-owned enterprises, but also they say that they're doing what the Americans did from roughly 1840 to about 1915, the century in which we became the dominant economy in the world. So they're following the American model as they understand it to have been in those days, which is very much a government-guided system. Our government built the railroads and the canals and opened up the West, provided just all kinds of benefits to companies, permitted large trusts to dominate the market, sought out shares, market shares from the British and Germans, who dominated pretty much everything in the beginning in the 1850s. So the Chinese write a lot about the American model, but they perceive us as having been government guided during our rise to world economic domination. So they see nothing wrong with their approach. They've invented a term for it they call the national champions system. The national champions are these monstrous state-owned enterprises that are some of the biggest corporations in the world. I use the corporation word advisedly because they are state-owned enterprises, and the Chinese Communist Party actually picks the leaders and rotates them around among the different corporations. Some of these corporations are the world's largest. I don't know if you follow the Forbes 500 or Fortune 500 biggest companies in the world by capitalization. China, when the system began about more than 10 years ago, had 0 on the top 500 corporations of the world. You know how many China has now? 90.
10?
90.
On the 500?
Yes. So 90 and growing. They have the world's largest bank. They have the world's largest oil company. These are generally state-owned enterprises who get special treatment by the Chinese government. And it's one thing our government is trying to undo and remind them that they've signed a World Trade Organization agreement, that they've promised in many, many ways not to favor their own companies with all these advantages and then discriminate it against American companies inside China. But they say, no, we're a poor country, we're not that smart, please let us do things our way for the time being. Or they just flat deny it and say, no, we treat your companies the same as our companies. This is where the issue of the Obama administration is raised, of cyber espionage by the government, right, even by the Chinese military, used to help Chinese companies, which is illegal in our system. We certainly have an NSA, and we certainly spy in other countries. But by law, we cannot take information we learn about a Chinese negotiating position in energy, let's say, and then give it to an American oil company. But the Chinese believe this is part of what the Americans must have been doing back in the 1800s. So they justify it to themselves. They have a whole series of things I try and describe in my chapter on the new Chinese economic system that they got in part from the World Bank. The World Bank taught them how to make these huge dinosaurs more productive, more profitable. And then we, through Goldman Sachs and various American companies, we said to them, you can privatize these gigantic government enterprises. You can sell their shares, not just the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, but we'll help you float these shares on Wall Street. And the Chinese at first said, no, we can't do that. These are government companies. You can't sell them to American Wall Street investors. That's what happened.
One of the kind of oblivions that I got in the book, though, is this kind of searching that they have both for this government-sponsored or led capitalism, which seems oxymoronic, and also a move to what you imply or you call as mercantilism, a economic system which I thought died out,
yes,
200 years ago.
Yes, it was supposed to.
and so part of your story is that these two kind of relics from the past are not only growing, but they are kicking our butt. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Mercantilism actually works. That's the dirty little secret about mercantilism. If you're a wise country and you want to help the whole world grow more efficiently, then you're against mercantilism. That's been our policy since 1945. We see, all American economists, or almost all anyway, see the 30s as a disaster because of mercantilism, competitive advantage, leading to unemployment, leading to World War II. So the idea of our institutions, 1945, World Bank, IMF, agreements on trade, our idea is to reduce tariff barriers, everybody cooperate, and in theory, everybody gets better. But mercantilism actually still works. If I decide to screw all my neighbors and build up my gold supply, which is what happened in the 1600s with the French taking the lead to do it first, it actually works. I can get all the gold over time, and I can screw my neighbors. I can block their products. I can export mine with a currency that's not really accurately valued, and that's what China's doing. They do it quite explicitly and consciously. They know what they're up to. And when we say to them, $4 trillion, that's trillion with a T, foreign exchange reserves, that's more than any other country by far. That's not supposed to happen under the 1945 trade system. They act sort of embarrassed. Well, yes, we do have $4 trillion, but it's because the Chinese people work hard.
Well, Robert Samuelson, the Nobel laureate,
yes,
he looks at this system, and in fact, since back in 07, he was writing about this, and saying that this could destroy the world economic system. So it seems to be like there's a huge threat here, which in one sense seems to be flourishing, but which in another sense seems to pose an economic threat that we really don't talk about, because I haven't really heard this discussion at all until I read your book, and then started researching and saw that guys like Samuelson have been writing about this, but it's been falling on deaf ears.
Well, because there's another magical solution that's supposed to happen. It's called the free trade school theory, that we can put up with mercantilism for a while, but ultimately the Chinese will realize that free trade, lowering market barriers, having an accurate currency, letting the private sector take over the commanding heights, all of these things will occur to the Chinese, and they will, if we just aren't mean to them in the meantime, they will naturally come out of it. And that school of economics is the dominant one. If you look at the Senate, for example, you'll find speeches by Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader, talking about the importance of free trade. So confronting China about this would require what is starting to happen now. In the current bill that's going to the Senate floor soon, the idea is going to be to strengthen our trade enforcement machinery, to start calling China and other countries too on violations of the world trade system. But this is really coming 20 years too late.
Who's sponsoring that legislation?
It's jointly sponsored by Orrin Hatch and Ron Wyden. It's a bipartisan.
So a Democrat from Oregon and a Republican from Utah.
Yes, Orrin Hatch is the chairman of the Finance Committee, which controls
for whom
trade.
He used to work at one point.
That's right. He's a believer in free trade, but I think even free trade senators have reached the limit when they see the results of Chinese mercantilism.
We only have a couple of minutes for the next break. Talk a little bit about how many programs the U.S. government has right now to help China's economy grow.
Well, that's one of my policy recommendations. We don't really know how many such programs there are to help China. They have all grown out of an order Jimmy Carter gave when he was president in 1979 after diplomatic recognition of China, that every department of the government should form a commission with the Chinese and help them. Commerce Department, Treasury, Agriculture. One of the most vivid examples is National Science Foundation, opening up an office in China and transferring for free with no conditions all of our scientific discoveries. This whole structure remains intact. It was never submitted to Congress. There's no law that says to do this. And often the budget doesn't really say China assistance on it. It will be, for example, Department of Agriculture wants to help China improve its productivity of its prairie grasses.
Right.
So it'll be in the International Affairs section of the Department of Agriculture budget. There's no inventory, if you will, of all that we have been doing to help China, which I suggest we should do that, in part to show China what we've been doing, so they'll stop demonizing us as trying to contain them, in part so we'll know what some of our negotiating leverage might be, and in part just to get history right in our own minds.
So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about a lot of your recommendations, but the first thing we're going to talk about are what you call the hawks in China, and what we should be doing, what they're thinking, why they're thinking that way, and what we can expect next. So we'll be back in 2 minutes with Michael Pillsbury on China.
This is firstgov.gov, where we're obsessed with getting you government information.
Brand new student loan applications on the site, baby. This calls for a celebration. Where's your uncle?
So in the end, it was either take the astronaut gig or come work here. What can I say? Duty called.
Dude, that's my cop.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that's Sam's cop.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No. Sam's? No.
Just log on or email us and get what you need.
C, change of address form. That's how it's done.
D, driver's license renewal.
E, emailing social security information.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Nice, we'll allow it. All right, then. What are those?
Government surplus cars for auction.
You posted those online last time.
No, you did.
I'm posting them online this time.
For all your government information, firstgov.gov.
Oh, what have we got here? Sometimes you feel tired. You can't seem to lose those extra pounds off your midsection. And your joints hurt when you take the stairs. Well, you're getting older. But I'm happy to say that there's some simple things we can do to keep you happy and healthy for years to come. We can also lower your risk for some serious diseases the older population is often subject to. Proper nutrition is more important than ever. Your body has changed, you know. Not as many treats. A basic exercise plan, lots of walks and fresh air, and most importantly, come and see me for twice-yearly checkups to help ensure the best possible quality of life. Now, how does that sound? Good boy.
Improve the quality of life for your elderly pet. Schedule twice-yearly checkups that include preventive care and regular lab work. a message from the veterinary members of the American Animal Hospital Association.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett. We're talking with Dr. Michael Pillsbury, author of the new book, The 100-Year Marathon, and we're talking about the future of United States and China relations. We've been talking about economics. We've been talking about foreign policy. Now I'd like to talk about kind of the military balance, military situation. First, I think we all have to understand and recognize that China lives in a pretty nasty neighborhood. You know, we talk about how crazy North Korea may be. Well, they have a long border with them. They have a border with Russia that spans, 8 time zones. They have they border Afghanistan. They border Burma and the Golden Triangle. So they have a historic enemy in Japan, and to a lesser extent, far lesser extent, a historic enemy in Korea. So, kind of a rough neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me, and I think we have another slide on this, what is it that the Chinese fear? Do they look at this, do they see these as potential enemies, or as today's enemies, potential enemies, or have they already negated them? What do they fear?
Well, China's biggest fear is not achieving the 100-year marathon. They know they need a growth rate to stay much higher than the American growth rate in order to do it. The World Bank told them in a secret meeting, I revealed the report the World Bank wrote back in beginning in 1983, actually, that only one other country has ever sustained 5.5 to 6% growth for the 30 years it will take you Chinese to surpass the Americans. And the way they did it was to keep their defense spending low. That country was Japan. It kept its defense spending at 1% of GDP. So the Chinese decided, we don't care what kind of enemy threats are on our borders. We're going to keep our defense spending low. And they even told the Chinese military, you guys need to be patient. You're going to have to wait for decades before you're going to get the money you need. And they kept defense spending probably at 1.5% of GDP. We don't know really for sure. While the GDP grew. So the whole idea was, if you're going to buy weapons for the defense of China, you need to be very clever about how cheap they are and what kind of leverage they have, what kind of ratio, offensive, defensive ratio they have. And one of the things they're most proud of, although they don't want to talk about it openly, but they've admitted it, and our government has said it many times in the last 5 years, they built a missile that cost about $5 million, that $5 to $10 million, let's give it a range, that can sink an aircraft carrier that cost us $13 billion with a B. So the ratio is enormous. A few of these missiles for one aircraft carrier.
It doesn't even have to be a few. I mean, you could have a monstrous number of them and it's still cost effective.
You could fire 50 of them.
Right.
It's still a good ratio. Same thing with our space program. They realized in 1991 from our own boasting that we had won the Gulf War in 1991 based on space reconnaissance, communications, battle damage assessment, even targeting being done from space. And they realized the Americans, especially a brilliant American Air Force officer named David Deptula, had pioneered this program. So they read the writings of the Americans and they said, my God, that's the Achilles heel of the Americans. What would it cost for a missile to be able to strike American satellites in space? How many such satellites are there? Just a few or 1,000? They found out, and they created an anti-satellite program that will cost us billions to try to be more resilient, to have smaller satellites, to be safe from this kind of attack. So this is another example. Keep defense spending low, grow your economy 2 or 3 or 4 times faster than the Americans, and also try to have weapons that you can deny they really exist. This is the assassin's mace concept. You say, well, yes, we may have a few missiles like that, but we're not going to tell you how many or much about them. And we're not going to engage in any arms control talks China has managed this massive rise to becoming the #1 economy in the world, the World Bank says, while avoiding any arms control negotiations with the United States or anybody else during this process. And part of the reason they've done that, first of all, they refuse the few proposals that have been made to them. And secondly, they say, we don't have any real military program to negotiate. We have very few, if any, weapons of any kind, so there's no need for arms control talks with China. Well, this is brilliant strategy, and it's worked so far.
I think we have a slide on it on the assassin's mace. If you guys could put that up, I'd appreciate it. Can you talk about the assassin's mace? That's a fascinating issue.
Well, it's a concept like the other principles of Chinese strategy. They draw a lot of concepts from ancient Chinese history. I try to show in the 100-Year Marathon a lot of materials written by the Chinese military where they're drawing lessons from the past. And the assassin's mace concept is a classic concept from Chinese novels where two forces are in conflict and one has a secret weapon aimed at the other side's Achilles heel, which he only springs on the other side at the final moment. That reverses what they call shi, the balance of power, and you win. But surprise and knowledge of the other side's weaknesses is crucial to the assassin's mace concept.
Can you talk about shi?
Well, shi is one of these concepts in the Chinese language that's quite different from Western vocabulary. There's no exact word for it. It's close to momentum or position or balance of power. Sometimes it means opportunity. And the concept of shi is basic to Chinese philosophy. You don't do things in the hard way and push yourself. You try to get the shi of the surrounding countries, if you will, to help you along. I called it a little bit like Tom Sawyer tricking his friends into painting the fence. Henry Kissinger brings up this concept in his new book on China 3 years ago. He says shi cannot be translated into English, but it's vital to Chinese strategy. And I think that's right.
I think we have a slide on that. It has the Chinese character in the middle. As I read your book, it seemed to be like other terms that shi could mean would be like kind of the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, the trends. Mm-hmm. This is how the world is going. And what the assassin's mace does, or what the strategy does, is all of a sudden shift that spirit, that shi, along a different mm-hmm. track. Is that close?
Yes. A key point of the idea of shi is to be ready to pivot instantly and change your strategy if the situation warrants it. That's why I mentioned to you about how their economic growth strategy, if they stayed on the same path of the 50s, they would have followed the Soviet model. Then the run that was wrong was the internal. Then they got on the idea of let's get everything from the Americans and follow a modified American model. Each of those pivots is an example of shi. When you learn a lesson from the past and you realize, I got to shift, I got to make a big change now.
And are there hawks in China today that want to make that pivot, want to make that shift now?
Well, we can see in their open articles that they're having a debate today about how much has the balance of power shifted. Should we stick to keeping our head down, low profile, just tremendous politeness to all of our neighbors and the small countries around China, or have our achievements justified a more assertive policy that small countries shouldn't be allowed to get away with offending China anymore? And it looks like in the last 5 years, what I call the rise of the hawks means that the move toward more assertiveness is underway, and they justify it in a very clever way. They say our GDP, our economy, relies about at least 10%, maybe more, on our maritime areas around China. So we can't allow little countries like Vietnam and the Philippines and many others to encroach on areas where there's fish, there could be undersea mineral resources, there could be oil and gas. This is part of our economic strategy, the 100-Year Marathon, from the book's title. And we can't allow our sort of politeness to get in the way of business anymore.
Well, why can't they allow that when their growth rate is approaching 10%? I mean, what are they going to gain by being more assertive?
Well, in the last 5 years, the growth rate has dropped.
Well,
for them, they had a dream come true growth rate of 10 to 12%. This is while we're at 2 or 3%. So it was 6 times faster than America.
Right.
Then it dropped to 5 times faster, then 4 times faster. Now they're worried because they're only growing 3 times faster than America. Some would even say, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, that they may be as slow as 4 or 5%. Well, gee, that's only double. That's only twice as fast as we're growing. So the hawks take advantage of this situation to say we can't afford to be so flexible toward our neighbors and possible resources while our growth rate has been declining. And for them, it'd be a dream come true for us to have a 5% growth rate. We'd be growing twice as fast as we have for the last 40 years.
Right. And at 5%, you still double your economy every 14 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's
we can't do
envious.
that. We can't do that.
And it would seem like since their economy is to a large part dependent upon trade, mm-hmm. then exactly the things that you were talking about before, not prodding people. What was that phrase that you had about not showing your weapons or not showing your hand?
It's been their foreign policy bumper sticker now for 30 years. It's called Tao Guang Yang Hui. Literally, it means hide your brightness and nurture your obscurity.
And it's worked pretty well for them.
Well, if you look at our people's view of China,
it's kind of walk softly and carry a big stick.
Not even carry a big stick.
Okay.
Give the appearance of not having a stick at all.
But when you have an economy that is soon to be the world's largest, and mm-hmm. you have 1.35 billion people. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you're going to have some weight in any conversation.
Well, yes, but they hit on a new idea, again, using Sure, in the early 90s. They found a few American economists then who were saying, China is going to double or triple us if this growth rate continues. Very alarming forecast being made 25 years ago. The Chinese then began to take delegations, including one I was on that I tell the story in the 100-year marathon, and they would take delegations around to meet economists saying, China is going to collapse. Jeff, don't be worried about our growth rate. We face problems of water supply. Our oil is running out. Cancer is everywhere. Our pollution is terrible. Our agricultural crops are not doing very well. We're going to collapse. And this is extraordinary for a rising power to tell visiting Americans, we're going to collapse, don't worry about us. And it worked. It's now a very widespread view in America. Don't worry about China. They have no hope.
We'll be back in just about 2 minutes, and then we're going to talk about what the United States should do.
Some dreams are universal. Dreams that inspire us. Multiple sclerosis is a devastating disease that changes lives forever. The National MS Society does more for people with MS than any organization in the world. But we can't do it alone. To get involved, visit us online at nationalmssociety.org. or call 1-800-FIGHT-MS. This is why we're here. Because nobody dreams of having multiple sclerosis.
What's wrong with this picture? Half of young Americans can't locate economic powers like Japan and India. 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. Without geography, our children aren't ready for the world. Geography is everywhere. It's incredible creatures, rhythm, fashion, flavor. It's economics and politics. It's change. Understanding connections between people and places is critical in the 21st century. That's why we created mywonderfulworld.org. Go there now for your free parent and teacher action kits. and give our kids the power of global knowledge. Because kids who understand our world today can succeed in it tomorrow.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
More of how they're doing.
Welcome back. I'm Jeff Barnett. We're getting the inside scoop on the future of U.S. and China relations from Dr. Michael Pillsbury, PhD from Columbia, served in Democratic and Republican administrations, speaks and writes Chinese Mandarin with fluency, and is the author of a best-selling book, The 100-Year Marathon. We've been talking about foreign policy, we're talking about economics, we're talking about the military hawks. But then the question remains is, okay, so what? You know, the old kind of consulting template of findings, conclusions, recommendations. So you've got in your book a series of 12 recommendations that you think that America should start implementing now. Mm-hmm. The title of it is of that chapter is America as a Warring State. And almost like an alcoholic, the first thing you want to do is recognize the problem. Can you talk about your recommendations?
Well, these 12 steps are how to get off an addiction. And I call it an addiction to helping China and not helping ourselves. There are a lot of Americans who will oppose all 12 recommendations, Jeff. A lot of Americans believe we've had our chance. We Americans have made too many mistakes. We've intervened around the world. We don't help our own people. So if China wants to assume world leadership, there's nothing really wrong with that. If China plays by the rules and earns its way to being twice as strong as we are economically, well, that's a good thing. So my recommendations really only appeal to Americans who don't want to yield world leadership to China. And I don't know how big that group is. I hope it's the majority of the country, but I'm not sure. And basically the recommendations begin with the need for consensus at home. We've got to have more of a coalition about American competitiveness. We don't do as well competitively as the Chinese do. We can fix that. There's a number of books and authors, a number of senators have had plans for this for quite some time in both parties, how to get America to be more competitive with other countries, especially China. And the list is quite long. It's tax reform, it's a series of steps that would enhance our companies' ability to compete overseas. It's much more serious trade enforcement when there are violations by other nations. That's the beginning. But right now, our country and our Congress, our public, generally speaking, does not recognize the problem of competitiveness because we've been on top for so long as number one with no challengers. And there's so much wishful thinking about China that it's either our friend or it's going to collapse or both, that there's no need for us to be more competitive. This is the first 2 or 3 recommendations. Recognize the problem, start measuring our own competitiveness. We don't have a presidential report that tells the Congress. This is how American competitiveness is doing. There's a private report put out by Davos every couple of years that shows our score
the World
is down.
Economic Forum.
Yes, it shows our score is down to about number 10 now. We're declining in competitiveness. Whether that's true or not from the White House's point of view seems to me ought to be the topic of a report to Congress.
Well, if I could put in there though, it is very difficult to measure value and competitiveness in the information age. We have great industrial age measures, but our information age measures are still lacking and still evolving. I want to challenge you a little bit on what you said that in the past we had no competitors, because we have. The Soviet Union was going to bury us. And then we needed to be more like the Japanese and the Germans. Mm-hmm. And then we need to be more like the Asian tigers. There's been a lot of nations, of groups. The EU was viewed as a threat. The euro was going to supplant the dollar as a world currency. That surge up, and then we take notice. Mm-hmm. But the basics of the American experiment have held firm. for reasons that I'm not sure anybody fully understands, but that our adaptation, our democratic capitalism, our free market works. And this authoritarian approach can certainly work for a time, can get you a great leap forward, but you eventually crash.
Well, it's certainly true the United States has changed its strategy from time to time, just as China has. The whole concept after the New Deal and President Franklin Roosevelt, that was really not even conceived of as something that the U.S. government could do. Teddy Roosevelt and the idea of breaking up the trusts or having national parks. These were inconceivable ideas until they became law and happened. What I'm talking about now is a much greater challenge than the Soviet Union. They never got to even 1/2 the size of our economy. Japan, not that much of a challenge, it turns out. The Chinese economy today, according to the World Bank, is about the same size as ours.
Right.
They've crept up on us without a sense of the need to change American strategy. On the contrary, the reason I wrote the book is to try to alert people that this is how China sees the world. I'm not giving my views of who will win the 100-year marathon. I'm giving Chinese authors' views. Can we afford to be so complacent that we really reform nothing in our country on competitiveness and don't even ask for an annual report on how we're doing from the president? This strikes me as a fairly elementary first step. And then I go on from there and have a set of recommendations about what we should do about China. Because people in 2049, looking back 34 years from now, if the Chinese win the marathon or come anywhere close to it, become double or triple the size of our economy, people will be asking, Jeff, why didn't you guys back in 2015 do something about this? Why didn't you try to get reforms in China? Why didn't you monitor the debate in China and take a side for the side that we think should win? Why didn't you call the Chinese out on trade violations or their massive pollution, their uncooperativeness on climate change? Why didn't you do these things back in 2015? Didn't you know the Chinese were so confident of what they're doing?
Because if they do keep on their present pace of growth, their pollution factors will double, triple what they are now, which are already horrendous. Is that?
Yes, they're the world's biggest polluter. It's not us anymore. And the Chinese take what they say is a very principled attitude. They say, we're not going to do anything serious on climate change for a very good reason. You Western powers, led by America, you got a free run of 100 years of all your pollution. And you got to be the world's biggest economy. Give us that chance, then we'll get more responsible on climate change, like 2049. And they actually say this. I quote some of the books and articles where they've been taking this position since 1980. And this very much frustrated President Obama at the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009, when he caught the Chinese kind of conspiring with 4 other countries against his proposal, taking the initiative to block his proposal.
So in your opinion, what you're seeing is that the Chinese are continually kind of poor-mouthing
themselves.
And there's almost this kind of imperialistic guilt that we may have, or Cold War guilt or something, and that we're still kind of paying a price and helping these guys compete with us to an extent that is no longer valid and needed.
That's one of the messages of the 100-year marathon is, look, if you want China to win the 100-year marathon and replace us, we're doing the right things now to make sure that happens.
And so you want us to protect the dissidents, to shame the polluters, to expose corruption, support democratic efforts within China.
Yes, I want a more active American strategy to reform China the way China's reformers would like to do. We missed a huge opportunity in 1989 when the students ran from the Tiananmen incident, went to Paris. The French government at first supported them. They elected a government in exile. They began to put out reports how China should change. The people who did this had been in the government, fairly high up, working for reforms in China. You know what America did? You would think we'd reach out and say, why, yes, how can we help you? At least make your views known. No, we cold shouldered them. We wouldn't let them come to America. We gave them no aid. And so the Chinese exile government in Paris, 1989, basically went away.
Because they already have one exile government in Formosa. Or no?
That actually is an important factor. The Taiwan model of democracy and economic development does have an impact on the Chinese leadership. We've seen them debating it for at least the last 10 years. So does the Hong Kong model. The Chinese have been trying very hard to not let their media cover the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. And the desire, rather simple desire from our point of view, why can't we elect our own leader in Hong Kong? They think it was promised to them. Mm-hmm. So here are all these students in the streets, no force being used against them. This is penetrating the Chinese firewall to some degree, so the Chinese leadership is aware. This argues against, by the way, a very old cultural argument, very, very common. Chinese people don't like democracy. They like Confucius. They like following orders. They don't like political parties. They don't like political conflict. They all want to work together under one leader.
Do you think
the
that's
Communist
true?
Party. Well, Taiwan and Hong Kong have shown that's not true.
Singapore would be another example.
Singapore is a little bit more in their favor, but even Singapore has a pretty vigorous democracy on some issues. So I think the Chinese Communist Party reformers want to push democracy more, and they hate this argument, this kind of patronizing argument from overseas. Well, the people of Confucius, you really need to just have an imperial structure and not bother your pretty little heads about democracy. The reformers who I want to strengthen and support, they say no, China can have democracy just like any other country.
And the reason you want to do that, and we just have about a minute left, we got to wrap it up, but the reason we want to do it is not to help us compete with China so much. It's that you see very destructive aspects of the Chinese economic model as it's presently being pursued, and that is what we must restrain. Is that correct? Is that close?
Well, I'm thinking ahead. I have a hunch they are going to succeed. I have a hunch they are going to have double or triple our growth rate, or get back up to 4 times our growth rate. So we are going to be looking at a much bigger economy. That's the China I would like to see be reformed rather than the one we have now.
If you like this discussion, pick up this book. I enjoyed it. It's a very fast read. It's a very enjoyable book. It'll fire synapses that have not been fired in a while.
And 70 pages of footnotes, too.
Thank you, Michael, very much.
Thank you, Jeff.